The gaming world erupted in quiet shock when Pearl Abyss announced the 5 million player milestone for Crimson Desert. Players celebrated the achievement, shared their conquests across social media, and invested countless hours exploring what they believed was a meticulously handcrafted universe. But beneath the surface of those glittering landscapes and intricate NPC interactions, something unexpected was stirring. A discovery that would reshape how millions of gamers evaluate the worlds they inhabit and force the entire industry to confront an uncomfortable question about authenticity, transparency, and the future of interactive entertainment. What if the worlds you had been exploring weren't built the way you thought? The revelation hit different gaming communities almost simultaneously. Deep within the game's asset files, players and data analysts discovered undisclosed artificial intelligence systems woven throughout Crimson Desert's architecture, not as a marketing feature, not as a transparent design choice announced in patch notes, but as hidden infrastructure that had shaped your experience without your knowledge. The studio had remained silent. No blog post explaining the technical innovation, no developer diary celebrating the breakthrough, just silence, followed by a carefully worded official statement that acknowledged the reality but offered no apology. This wasn't a scandal in the traditional sense. No stolen code, no fraudulent claims about player counts, no broken promises about gameplay systems. Instead, this was something far more significant, a watershed moment where the boundary between human authorship and algorithmic generation became impossible to ignore. 5 million players had already purchased and invested their time in a game that was fundamentally different from what industry transparency standards would suggest. The controversy crystallized around a central tension. Pearl Abyss had made a choice to integrate artificial intelligence into 3 distinct layers of their game world. The first layer was visible but mechanical, procedurally generated environmental assets, textures on countless surfaces, and props scattered throughout the landscape. Most players never consciously registered these systems. The visual quality was high enough that the artificial origin remained invisible. The second layer was far more interesting. Artificial intelligence-powered NPC behavior, dialogue variations, and character decision-making systems that created the illusion of a living world where inhabitants responded dynamically to player actions. The third layer was genuinely transformative. Dynamic economic systems, weather pattern evolution, and population behavior algorithms that made Crimson Desert's world feel genuinely alive in ways that purely scripted games could never achieve. To understand what this really means, you need to step back and recognize that this isn't unique to Crimson Desert. This is a watershed moment that reveals a truth the entire gaming industry has been dancing around for years. Artificial intelligence has been quietly reshaping how AAA studios approach world building, and the revelation of undisclosed AI systems in a game that had already reached 5 million sales forced an industry-wide reckoning. The discovery came not from official channels, but from the community itself. Players and data analysts reverse engineered the game's systems, traced the patterns that didn't match traditional development pipelines, and published detailed technical analyses. The evidence was irrefutable. Pearl Abyss responded with a statement that acknowledged the use of artificial intelligence in specific development processes. But the damage to trust was already crystallizing. Players who loved the game suddenly questioned whether their emotional connection to the world was authentic or engineered. Journalists began investigating which other major studios were quietly using similar systems. Regulators started asking uncomfortable questions about industry standards and consumer transparency. This moment matters because 5 million copies sold represents millions of individual players who made purchase decisions based on incomplete information. They trusted the marketing, they trusted the reviews, they trusted the franchise legacy. They invested money, time, and emotional energy into a world they now understood differently than they had before. The game itself hadn't changed. The experience remained identical. But everything about how that experience was perceived, evaluated, and discussed shifted instantly. Before we continue deeper into what this revelation means for game development, the industry, and your future as a player, making informed choices about which worlds you inhabit, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Your perspective matters as we explore what comes next. The 3 AI layers in Crimson Desert represent more than just technical innovation. They represent a fundamental shift in how game worlds are constructed and experienced. Understanding these layers is essential to grasping why the revelation matters so profoundly, and why this moment will define industry standards for years to come. The first layer, visual assets, operates at the foundation of perception. When you stand atop a cliff in Crimson Desert and gaze across sprawling valleys, vast forests, and distant mountain ranges, your brain processes extraordinary environmental detail, thousands of unique textures, individually crafted rock formations, vegetation patterns that feel natural rather than repetitive. What Pearl Abyss never explicitly disclosed was that artificial intelligence systems generated significant portions of these visual elements. The studio's artists created foundational templates and quality gates, but algorithmic systems filled in the staggering volume of environmental detail that would have required decades of manual labor. This layer remained largely invisible to players because the quality threshold was high. Your brain accepted what it saw as intentional design. The mechanical origin stayed hidden beneath visual authenticity. The second layer operated in the emotional domain, where players directly interact with the world's inhabitants. Every NPC you encountered in Crimson Desert possessed dialogue trees that responded to your actions, your previous choices, your reputation, and contextual circumstances. The conversations felt natural because artificial intelligence systems analyzed millions of language patterns and generated responsive dialogue variations that departed from rigid scripting. When an NPC remembered you from a previous encounter, when they expressed genuine concern about consequences you had created, when their emotional responses felt nuanced rather than mechanical. You were experiencing the output of neural language models making real-time decisions about how characters should behave. This layer profoundly shaped emotional engagement. Players believed they were interacting with carefully authored personalities when they were actually conversing with probabilistic language systems trained on human dialogue patterns. The third layer, World Systems, represents the most transformative application of artificial intelligence. Crimson Desert's economy operates dynamically, responding to player behavior, resource scarcity, demand fluctuations, and supply chain disruptions caused by server populations. Weather patterns evolve based on seasonal systems that feel organic rather than cyclical. Population behavior algorithms determine where NPCs travel, which businesses thrive, which settlements decline, creating the genuine sensation that your actions have consequences rippling through an interconnected economic ecosystem. This layer distinguishes Crimson Desert from traditional open-world games, where economies are static backdrops and weather cycles repeat predictably every few in-game days. The algorithmic systems make the world genuinely responsive to aggregate player behavior. What Pearl Abyss failed to communicate was how integrated these layers had become. The studio marketed Crimson Desert as an innovative world that felt alive, immersive, and reactive. Marketing materials emphasized the sophisticated NPC systems and dynamic economies without specifying that artificial intelligence generated the underlying infrastructure. This wasn't dishonesty in a strict sense, but it was incompleteness at a scale that mattered. When 5 million players purchased the game, they made economic decisions based on incomplete technical disclosure. Some players might have chosen differently had they understood the full scope of AI integration. Others would have appreciated the innovation more thoroughly. The point is that informed consent requires transparency about foundational design choices. The industry's response revealed something crucial. Most major studios had been quietly adopting similar approaches. Artificial intelligence systems already power asset generation, NPC behavior systems, and dynamic world mechanics in numerous unreleased titles. The difference is that Crimson Desert reached 5 million sales before the revelation emerged. Smaller indie developers had been experimenting with these systems openly, often including transparency in patch notes and developer diaries. But larger studios concerned about competitive advantage and potential backlash maintained silence. This silence created the real controversy. Not that artificial intelligence was being used, but that consumers were left in the dark about fundamental aspects of how their entertainment was constructed. The revelation forced an industry reckoning that had been building for years. Suddenly, every developer faced pressure to answer uncomfortable questions about their own pipelines. Every studio had to confront whether their competitive advantage was worth the trust damage that eventual discovery might cause. Pearl Abyss had calculated that silence carried lower risk than transparency. The market immediately proved that calculation wrong. Trust, once broken, requires years to rebuild. The revelation forced Pearl Abyss into a corner where every statement became scrutinized. Every defensive explanation amplified the core problem. The studio eventually issued a formal disclosure acknowledging AI integration across all 3 layers, but the damage had already crystallized into industry-wide consequence. Within weeks, players began analyzing other major titles with forensic intensity. searching for undisclosed AI systems in games they thought they understood completely. The precedent had shifted from assumption of transparency to demand for verification. What emerged from this pressure was an unexpected clarity about game development reality. Developers began publicly acknowledging that artificial intelligence had become fundamental infrastructure, not optional enhancement. Studios that had invested years hiding AI integration suddenly found themselves competing against rivals who leaned into disclosure as competitive advantage. Players responded positively to transparency. A mid-tier developer who published patch notes detailing their AI-assisted asset generation pipeline experienced a significant trust boost among their community. The market had spoken. Disclosure was not liability. Silence was. The philosophical implications expanded beyond corporate accountability. Game critics began reevaluating what authenticity means in algorithmic systems. If an NPC conversation feels emotionally resonant because neural networks trained on millions of human dialogue patterns generated it, is that experience less authentic than dialogue written by a single human author? If a landscape feels natural because AI systems distributed visual elements with probabilistic variation that mimics organic growth, does the algorithmic origin diminish the player's emotional response? These questions proved surprisingly difficult to answer with certainty. The industry's regulatory environment shifted noticeably in response. Gaming commissions in multiple countries began drafting guidelines requiring disclosure of AI-assisted systems in commercial games. Some proposals attempted to mandate labeling similar to content rating systems. Others suggested transparency requirements in marketing materials. Pearl Abyss and other studios engaged actively in these regulatory discussions, recognizing that setting standards themselves was preferable to having standards imposed externally. The company's eventual cooperation with regulatory efforts actually rebuilt some damaged trust. Transparency, when finally embraced, became an unexpected asset. For developers, the Crimson Desert revelation accelerated a skill evolution already underway. Roles began shifting. Traditional game designers increasingly became systems architects who conceptualized how artificial intelligence would generate content rather than designing every encounter manually. Artists evolved into quality gatekeepers and style directors, establishing parameters and aesthetic standards that algorithmic systems then executed. Programmers developed expertise in machine learning integration and neural network optimization within game engines. The industry wasn't replacing skilled workers, it was demanding different skills, forcing career transitions that proved disorienting for some veterans, while creating new opportunities for specialists who understood both game design and artificial intelligence. The narrative expanded to encompass fundamental questions about what games could become. If artificial intelligence could generate infinite procedural variations of NPC encounters, environmental details, and dialogue responses, what separated a game with authentic authored storytelling from one that felt authored but relied fundamentally on algorithmic generation? Studios began explicitly positioning themselves along this spectrum. Some embraced systemic games, where procedural systems created emergent narratives. Others doubled down on authored experiences, where human creators controlled every meaningful moment, using AI only for supporting infrastructure that remained invisible to players. Crimson Desert's 5 million player milestone ultimately represented something larger than a single game's commercial success. It marked the inflection point where artificial intelligence integration became industry standard rather than competitive secret. Players adapted to this reality faster than industry observers expected. The emotional energy of the initial controversy dissipated into acceptance. New games launched with AI integration openly documented, and players integrated this information into their purchasing decisions without existential hand-wringing. The technology had become normalized within months. What persisted was a fundamental shift in how the gaming community evaluated entertainment. Players developed literacy around algorithmic systems. They learned to ask which aspects of their experience came from human intention and which emerged from probabilistic systems. They understood that authenticity and algorithmic origin were not mutually exclusive concepts. This knowledge transformed how people engage with games, creating more sophisticated consumers who appreciated innovation while remaining vigilant about transparency. The future expanded into possibility. Pearl Abyss invested heavily in next-generation systems that pushed AI integration further. Competitors accelerated their own development pipelines. Indie developers experimented with affordable neural network tools that democratized capabilities once exclusive to AAA studios. The industry had crossed a threshold. Artificial intelligence in games was no longer controversial technology. It was inevitable infrastructure. And how developers chose to implement and disclose it would define their relationship with players for years to come.